Stegner Center for our second green bag presentation of this semester. I'm Bob Kiter. I've had the privilege of serving as a director of the Wallace Stegner Center for the last many years. I'll leave it at that. Let me, just a couple of quick announcements before I introduce our speaker today. First, the usual, please turn off cell phones so we're not interrupted. Secondly, there's a sign-up sheet going around with email addresses. Please do that so we can keep you apprised of events that the Stegner Center is hosting. I'd also like to thank on behalf of the Stegner Center, the University of Utah Credit Union, which is a sponsor for this year's Stegner Center Green Bag presentations. We're very grateful to the credit union for their support. A couple of announcements about future upcoming events. February 6th, that's next week. We've got 3 events coming up in February, I should note. We have Chris Linder, a conservation photographer, filmmaker, and lecturer who will be presenting on his recent book, The Big Thaw, Ancient Carbon, Modern Science, and a Race to Save the World. On February 13th, in an act of shameless self-promotion, I will be presenting on recently completed research. The presentation's entitled The Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem Revisited, Law, Science, and the Pursuit of Ecosystem Management in an Iconic Landscape. And then on February 18th, we'll be hearing from Emily Lewis, a graduate of the College of Law who's working in water law at the Clyde Snow Sessions law firm and is involved in research on the concept of water banking, water obviously being an important resource here in the state of Utah. And then on March 19th and 20th, Stegner Center will host our 25th annual symposium on the topic of food and the environment, resilient and equitable food security for the West. Registration is required for that event, and we do have on the table outside recently received brochures about the annual symposium, so please feel free to pick one up on your way out this afternoon. Now it's my pleasure to introduce a former student who has done well for himself. And that's Brian Steed, who was appointed recently Executive Director for the State Department of Natural Resources by Governor Herbert. The agency is comprised of 1,300 employees who serve in 7 divisions. I think Brian will get into those divisions, so I won't recite them. Brian previously served in Washington, D.C. as the Bureau of Land Management's Deputy Director for Policy and Program, and while in that capacity served as Acting Director of the Bureau of Land Management from 2017 to this past year. He previously served in D.C. as Chief of Staff to Congressman Chris Stewart from 2013 to 17, and he's also served as Deputy County Attorney for Iron County here in the state of Utah and taught political science and economics at Utah State University, which is indeed where he earned both his undergraduate degree and a Master of Arts in Political Science. But his education did not stop there. He holds a PhD in Public Policy with an emphasis on environmental policy from Indiana University in Bloomington, and a Juris Doctorate degree from the S.J. Quinney College of Law, where I recall him in my natural resources class a few years ago. Brian and his wife are now in the process of relocating with their children back to Utah. It goes without saying that he truly enjoys the outdoors and various outdoor activities ranging from hiking, biking, skiing, fishing, and anything else that you can do outdoors. So with that, Brian, we're very pleased to have you here and to hear about your plans for the Department of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Appreciate it. Thanks, Bob. I appreciate that. I'm actually going to try the dual microphone system, if that's okay. And I had to move my bag, so you'd have to look at my messy bag while I was here. Is that okay if I use this mic? Can you hear me okay? All right. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I have prepared, because I used to be a college professor, a lengthy PowerPoint presentation. I'm not lying about that. It's 35 slides, super dreamy stuff. And I mean dreamy because I hope to put you all asleep. It's right after lunch. It's when I used to teach a very large macroeconomics class about the size of this room, maybe a little larger, filled with undergraduate students who had absolutely no interest in economics. I hope to have that same effect. I'm also very excited to be here because I get to be filmed, which is one of the things that I just love about presenting, because then everything I say is recorded and probably will be used against me in the court of public opinion. So I'll be careful on how I present this. Two things I want to say, though. First of all, it's good to be back, and I have parentheses kind of there. I was not a great law student. I've just got to be honest with you. I remember being in one of these colloquia and sitting when one of the presenters came up, and he was a judge, and he said, "You know, I have to admit, I kind of got sick to my stomach coming in the building today." I totally related to that, and I thought that'll never be me. I came in the building and I'm like, oh boy. So just don't ask me any hard questions, and don't use the Socratic method, and we should get through this just fine. But professionally, I have to say, really a huge thank you, and in two ways. First of all, I have to say this. We at DNR have a phenomenal partnership with the SJ Quinney College of Law, and particularly with the natural resources and environmental programs here. And we couldn't do what we do without the good education that's presented there. We have two fellowship programs, if you're a student, that you should be interested in. The DUSNEP, which is for more first years, where you're able to spend at least the summer in residence at DNR, working for the AG's office. And then we have the O'Hara program, which is what I would consider one of the best fellowship programs for legal training in the nation. And that's just not hyperbole, because I work at DNR. We actually give the students an opportunity to clerk for summers, and then to come down and actually do substantive practice of law for 2 years, all at the expense of the O'Hara program. It's a really cool program, and it's a great educational experience. And I promise you, if we were to go around and list the number of employees that have come through that program, you would know a lot of the names. You would not find my name on the list. I tried. But now I have the ultimate revenge of being able to say yes or no to the next batch of O'Hara Fellows. So whatever that's worth. Secondly, I wanted to say a personal thank you to Professor Kiter and to others that teach here at this school. My first year of law school, well, it kind of stunk. I got to be honest with you. It was hard. My dad was diagnosed with cancer, and there was a bunch of stuff going on in my personal life, and it was just a hard time. And I really didn't find my voice in law school until my second and third years, when I was able to participate in the natural resources and environmental programs and to pursue that certificate. And I owe so much to this school for helping me to understand the nuances of what can be a very tricky subject. And I'm truly grateful for Professor Kiter. We used to call them the Bearded Bobs. Bearded Bob Adler and Bearded Bob Kiter. Bob Adler ruined it by shaving it, but you know, it happens. Okay, next is the presentation today. So I want to introduce people to the DNR. I can tell you 20 years ago, if I was sitting here in this, I wouldn't have had really any information on the breadth of what DNR does. I think that's a compelling story, and it's interesting to hear about, and so I'm going to try to introduce you to the agency that I oversee. And in addition to that, I'm going to try to provide a brief overview of the issues that I've dealt with in each of those divisions. So there are 7 divisions that I oversee. We'll get into that in the next slide, but I'll give you some of the pressing issues that I've dealt with. That means this is going to be kind of a crappy presentation. Lots of slides, lots of different material, lots of different subjects, and so I'll have to come back another time to delve in deeper on any one of these. But I think there's some value in understanding the breadth. And then, of course, we'll have time for questions and answers. So with that, let's talk about the DNR. As you can see, there are 7 divisions, and those are all their insignia, and I'm going to go through one at a time. So I'm going to start over here in the corner with water resources and water rights. Water resources is charged with the conservation efforts as well as the management of generally surface water and getting water from point A to point B. So it's both the development and the conservation arm of the department. Also, next to the water resources is water rights, who, if you're a water attorney, are your best friends, because these are the people that allocate and make sure that there's sufficient water. And we have some representatives here that if you get hard questions, I'm just going to send them that way. Not naming anybody, Teresa. Sorry. In addition to that, I'm going to cover forestry, fire, and state lands. It says forestry up there, but the true title is forestry, fire, and state lands. I'll tell you about what they do when we get to that slide. State parks, wildlife, everyone's favorite, oil, gas, and mining, and Geological Survey. So, with that brief introduction of what we oversee, I'm going to go through with kind of what we do in each of those things. And I'm going to talk specifically about some of the things that have, as I mentioned, occupied the bulk of my time in the last 7 months that I've been at DNR. So let's talk about water rights adjudications. I think there is no pressing or more pressing issue in the West than water rights. And I would say water availability generally. We are witnessing two facts that are hard to watch. One, you're watching a growth in population in the West, which means more demand. B, in some cases, you're seeing less supply. And I don't care how you stand on the global warming debate, we can talk about that later, but if you believe the global warming models, you'll see that the West is predicted to be hotter and drier. And then even if you don't believe that and you just believe in history, if you go back in time and do tree core samples along the Colorado Basin, you'll find that most of the river, as well as other things, were adjudicated at a time of abnormally high water. Which means if we're predicting the future, we're going to have more people with more demands and less water. So water rights adjudications is one of the most important things we do. This is where the state engineer's office and the Division of Water Rights generally sits down, works with communities to find out how they're going to make ends meet with the water availability that they currently have. It's a complicated process. It's a very time-consuming process. And honestly, it's a very emotionally charged process, because sometimes you're telling people who are later to the game, I'm sorry that you didn't have the right you think you had, and there's hard decisions to be made. I can tell you that I have some personal experience in this. My PhD dissertation when I was in Indiana, which I was a Utah boy, I went from Utah to Indiana to study California water, which makes total sense. But in California, I was doing groundwater management over long time horizons, mostly in the Los Angeles basin. And they have, I mean, if you're looking at the future of where things might go, you look to see a basin where you have a stagnant source of water, meaning that it's not stagnant, you're just not increasing the amount of water that's locally available, when you add about 10 million people over that time frame, and that's a big story. We along the Wasatch Front and other places in Utah are experiencing unprecedented growth. Over the last 10 years, Utah was the fastest growing state in the nation. Most of that growth happened along the Wasatch Front, and we're going to have some complicated decisions to make. So I can't speak highly enough of the people at Water Rights for doing this very difficult work. They do a great job, and if you want to see how this ongoing process is unfolding, there's a process in the Salt Lake Valley that's going on right now. We recently completed processes in Iron County, which is in, if you don't know where that is, where Cedar City is. And those processes, both we're working with the town of Cedar now, as well as the town of Parowan, both of which have probably overallocated water basins. What that means is you're seeing a depletion of those water basins. There's not a lot of surface flow into either of the communities, which means there's going to be some tough decisions to make. And I'm not predicting how that turns out, but I can say their neighbors to the west in Burl and other areas, Burl Junction, have seen tremendous surface subsidence where water is floating the surface. When that water is drawn down, you see the surface sink, and that's something that you hate to see as a water manager, and so we're trying to stem off some of those things. So adjudication. Second thing I want to mention, and I know you're going to have a longer presentation about this, so water banking, and I put in there split season use. The reason I included these up is because we have, for the last 7 months that I've been here, and really the Division of Water Resources and Water Rights have been working for the last probably 2 or 3 years on trying to get our heads around how to do water banking effectively. For those that are paying attention, this is how it happens. We have an allocated amount of water. That allocated amount of water is given in terms of a right. right? But as the law currently stands, if you don't put that water to beneficial use, that water is subject to forfeiture. And because it's subject to forfeiture, if you were to say, you know, I decide not to use my water this year, and that water then flows downstream for an in-stream flow, or just you put it on hold for a year, there's a possibility that your rights will be forfeit. And as a forfeit right, that you then go to the back of the queue on availability for water. And nobody wants to be in that position. Water banking is a mechanism where you can get together with volunteers, people that want to participate in this, and decide, you know, what we'd like to do is to provide a mechanism so we don't have that kind of buy and dry scenario. It is a complicated bill. I'd invite you all to go pick it up and read it. It's interesting, so it's being discussed this legislative session on water banking in particular. It'll be an interesting debate. It's not uniformly loved. There are those in the agriculture community and others that really fear what this looks like. And so that's something to keep your eyes on. Split season use is essentially a companion bill that would allow you as a water user to sell, let's say, so I'm a farmer, I put an especially efficient new technology to work on my farm, and so I haven't used my entire water right, even though I have, in fact, grown the crops I need that year. The question is what happens to the rest of that water? Can you then transfer that water on a split season basis to someone else? Right now, the law would say no. This is a change in the law that will allow for that ability. That's a quick and dirty overview of what this is, and my water experts over here can talk more fully about it if you have questions afterwards. But I think these are important changes in the law. I think that we're trailing in this state, other states that have already led the way on this, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. All that being said, it will be a work in progress for some time. The state engineer's office is going to have to get up to speed on how to do this, and it's going to be a learning by doing, and that will be an interesting thing. So, water rights and water resources continued. Water resources in charge of the various conservation programs throughout the state. I won't get into these in detail, but there's a variety of things both on the ag side as well as on the residential side on how we can increase efficiency in water use. The vast majority of water used in this state is done outdoors, either for agriculture or for your local lawns. We're acutely aware of that and trying to get ahead of that problem and providing other mechanisms. And we're not only advocating that you rip up your lawn. That's been tried in some places, but there's been some costs to that as well. If you look at the city of Tucson as a for instance, who did have a very extensive turf removal program and then stopped watering, many of their trees have died, which has created a heat sink around Tucson. So we're trying to avoid some of those, so smartly going about these conservation programs. One of the tools that we're using on that is setting statewide conservation goals. We recently came out with a document setting those statewide conservation goals, and we were criticized both by the water providers and a lot of water conservationists, which tells us that maybe that we've arrived in a defensible spot. But as well as Mark Twain is fabled to say, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. Conservation is something that we're going to have to take a very hard look at and decide how we proceed on that as a state. And next, I'll get onto the controversial tier. So in water rights and resources, we're trying to meet tomorrow's water needs. And we've determined that that's going to require conservation, improved efficiency, and additionally developing new water sources when necessary. I'm of the mind, and we can quibble about this later if you'd like, that we probably can't conserve our way out if the growth continues the way it has historically. So we have to take a hard look on water development statewide, and that's something that we can do with our partner agencies. And these are the kind of the four major water providers throughout the state. And I mean the raw water providers, the people that get water from reservoir to your municipal provider. This is going to involve a statewide conversation. I'm not naive enough to think that it won't, because ultimately there's going to be hard feelings on either side of this. But it's something to be aware of, and it's something that we're trying to get right. So that's water rights and water resources. Next, forestry, fire, and state lands. And I've put some of you to sleep already, so my mission's accomplished. This is going, and I'm speaking as fast as I can, so we can get through my 35 slides. Forestry, fire, and state lands, as you might be able to tell from the title, there are three separate activities that forestry, fire, and state land does. Do you have guesses what they might be? forestry, fire, and state lands. So that's what we'll talk about. Let's talk about forestry first. Utah is in a unique spot. We have no state forests. We do have a state forester, and that state forester is charged with managing the forest resources that we have. That state forester is in charge of kind of fire efforts, as well as some other things, the Forest Legacy Program, which is where you work with private forest owners to put their forest tracts into conservation easements. By and large, it's a federal program. We oversee that program, as well as, interestingly, urban forestry. And before you poo-poo urban forestry, it's a very big deal. It's a big deal in terms of your water quality, because as water falls from the sky and it traps in trees, especially in rainfall, that disperses that rainfall event, meaning that it'll fall slower and you won't have the flooding. Also, if that overflows or overlays a road, you will actually have less pollutants that come into your water source that will eventually come in your water sources through your gutters. It's a big deal, and trying to get that urban forestry right is not easy. It's safe to say that this will be an increasingly important conversation going forward. The last thing I'd like to talk about with the forester is our shared stewardship program. I don't know if who here has ever heard of the state of Utah suing the federal government over resource issues? I'm just curious, by show of hands. Wow, there's a lot of you. Shocking. It turns out that we as a state have spent lots of money pursuing litigation results from the federal government. Some of those lawsuits have kind of revolved around how forests are managed. And as I said, we don't have state forests, so we're looking at federal forests on how they're managed. And one of the lawsuits that was threatened anyway was one regarding the roadless rule. The state was approached the middle of the summer by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and was said, hey, we know you've got this petition to change the state's roadless rule. That's all well and good. We're not going to get to it. Is there something else we can do in the meantime, which started this conversation? And the conversation was, could we work together with the state, with counties, and with federal agencies, mainly the Forest Service at this time, to find out if there are certain projects that we can mutually engage in. And Sonny Perdue, the Secretary of Agriculture, came out and signed it with the governor. You'll see the picture here. This is when we put it into action. And that Mary Farnsworth is on this end from the Forest Service. The guy in the middle looking awkward is me. And then Brian Cottom is our state forester. And this is the governor announcing the projects that we selected. We were able to treat tens of thousands of acres of forest lands in order to A, reduce fire, the risk of catastrophic fire, and B, to then preserve watersheds. And you might say, gosh, is that really that important? And I'm here to tell you, yeah. If you go up Big Cottonwood Canyon right now, or Little Cottonwood, you're going to see a big sign that says no dogs, right? You're going to see a sign that says no dogs, and then you're going to see a smaller sign that says no swimming, right? And then you're going to see other signs that say, please don't use the facilities out of doors, right? All of those actions are designed to protect the watershed that all of us rely on today. I can tell you one thing that will guaranteedly ruin your watershed is if that goes up in a catastrophic wildfire. And it's been our history as we've watched this. So the town of Bryan Head, there was a fire, it burned over the mountain into the city of Panguitch Lake, and then the area around Panguitch Lake. Panguitch Lake is important for the city of Panguitch for its water supply. And Panguitch has very few people, but they are spending millions and millions and millions of dollars now to purify their water based on the amount of flow they get now every time it rains or if there's a flooding event. It's important that we identify that. So shared stewardship is the way we work with our federal partners to indeed identify those priorities and make that happen. It's been a really cool program. And so I was a Fed, I admit it, I was a Fed. But I was able to spend a week with Chief Christensen, the Chief of the Forest Service, when she was out here doing her Chief's review of the U.S. Forest Service, and this is something that they've internalized. And also, when I can have county commissioners who are normally really ready to take out weapons against the feds and have them sit down and say, yeah, this is working for us, and have state officials who would normally use resources in litigation to then use those resources for actual management, this is a win-win, and I think it's a really cool thing, and it's something that Utah's leading on. And I'm really proud of it, and I hope it continues to work because it's been a good program. Other things that Forestry, Fire, and State Land does, I alluded to this, fire. Fire is an increasingly important part of the West. It always has been. It's a natural part of the West, but we didn't always understand how important it was. And so if you look at forest fire management regimes over the last, 130 years, we tried really hard to suppress a lot of fires. That's led to a lot of fuel buildup. You combine that fuel buildup with, as I mentioned before, a hotter, drier climate, and you have a setup for a pretty catastrophic situation. We're trying very hard to reduce those fuel loads, so there has been a kind of a sea change on understanding how to deal with fire. We spent a lot of money on fire suppression, which is very important. We will continue to spend a lot of money on fire suppression to make sure that people are safe. But an increasingly important part of the conversation as well is this slash pile burning down here to where you're actually going out, identifying those areas that are overgrown, and then thinning that forest in the way that the forest fire would have done otherwise, and then getting it back to a more natural fire regime. And then if it burns, it doesn't burn as catastrophically, and you don't lose a bunch of your resources that you're trying to protect, whether that be the timber resource for some or the recreational resource for others. Both of these are helped by this. Now, it's not a cost-free endeavor. Prescribed fire is hard to get right. One of the interesting bills I'd invite you to look at in the state legislature this year is how the state is dealing with the air quality clearinghouse. And so if there is an air quality problem, whether or not the state can use prescribed fire or not, I don't know how that plays out, but it'll be an interesting one to see how it plays out in the legislature. And it would allow for more burning days. However, there's going to be an obvious conflict with air quality and how we play that out. So I don't have to worry about air quality. That's DEQ's problem. I'm teasing. We all worry about air quality. So, okay, other thing they do, which again seems somewhat not exactly in line, but it's also very important, is they manage state lands. And I'm going to give extra points here for those that can tell me what a state land is. And it's not SITLA. Gosh, I don't see anybody raising their hands here. These are sovereign lands from the state of Utah at time of statehood. We have a lot of them around big bodies of water like the Bear Lake and what we should see here is the Great Salt Lake. Some around Utah Lake as well, and we are in charge of managing those sovereign lands. Right here you see in the picture is a marsh masher of sorts. They're going out to clean out an invasive species called Phragmites. Phragmites is a water-hungry plant. It looks beautiful, which is how it was introduced, but it's not good for the ecosystem, and what it'll do is it will go into every standing body of water and it will drain it. And it will just then be a stand of what looks to be cattails, but they're not cattails, it's Phragmites. Go out anywhere along the Great Salt Lake and you will find Phragmites stands. We're trying very hard to get ahead of that. It's good for waterfowl, and it's actually good for water as well. The more that we limit that Phragmites, the better likelihood is that we can save lake levels, which is going to be a challenge going forward as well. So, sovereign lands, there's an interesting bill that will likely be introduced this year as well on sovereign lands that deals with everyone's favorite stream access. And I don't know how that's going to play out, so I'd invite you to read it yourself. That issue has launched a series of lawsuits. I think it will continue to be one of those things that we discuss as a state. So, moving right along to wildlife resources. A surprising amount of my time, and I hesitate to admit, okay, I will. I know it's film, but I'm not really a hunter, okay? But a surprising amount of my time is spent on dealing with elk and deer. And this has been one of the eye-opening things coming from a federal position to a state position on the amount of time that goes into getting these numbers right, which is much harder than you think. It turns out that if you're a farmer living around a large elk herd, you think that there are too many elk, right? In fact, you're going to come to the state and ask them to pay you compensation for the amount of crops that are eaten by those elk. If you're a hunter in that same area, I almost guarantee you perceive that there are too few elk. This is the nature of humanity, and it makes for a very interesting conversation to where, and then if you're a hunter who also farms, that's a very confusing conversation. Because then it depends on where those elk are. Good elk on the mountain, bad elk are on your crops. And how you deal with those. Mule deer in a very, very similar situation. We have seen lower numbers of both elk and deer in certain areas. Some of that is just based on ecology, that we've had some hard winters, and we went from a period of historic drought, which is not good for deer, elk, to a period of big snow. So you already have diminished body conditions going into a big snowfall, which is then also bad for deer and elk, because then you can't make it through the winter. And we do collaring studies, so we go out and catch fawns, we collar them, and then we go out and release those fawns to see what happens to them. We've had, in some areas, almost 100% mortality of those fawns year over year, just because it was a very hard winter. So it's one of those things that we have to look at, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but some of the blame also probably has to do with an increased predator population, which we've been noticing throughout the state as well. Second wildlife resource issue that I've been dealing with a lot are sheep and goats. Everybody's favorite, right? Sheep probably were the species of rock-dwelling ungulate that lived most likely across the Wasatch Front and down into southern Utah. There are 3 different variants of it. And it turns out, though, that sheep are really hard to get back to where they were. And that's also to do with human contact. Wild sheep are not immune to a series of respiratory illnesses that domestic sheep are immune to. And so if you have domestic sheep in an area, it's very hard to reintroduce those bighorn sheep. Goats don't have that same problem, and so have been introduced to a lot of places that they may not have been historically. And that's also an issue of controversy. And then you'll see this helicopter. That's actually a goat transfer. And I actually went on a sheep transfer out to the Ochre Mountains. And if you get a chance, tomorrow, it's Wednesday, out at Antelope Island, we'll be doing a sheep release. The sheep on Antelope Island all caught MOVI, this respiratory illness, last year, and were all either killed by that disease or put down because they then carry it for the rest of their lives. But there'll be a sheep release tomorrow. It's super cool. And to get that close to a bighorn sheep, I've never seen anything like it before. And so go see it. It's very cool. Not to put a shameless plug in, but it's an opportunity the public's welcome to, and I don't have the details, but if you actually leave me your stuff, I can let you know when. Okay. Sage grouse. I spent a disproportionate amount of time when I was the BLM on sage grouse. It is still a controlling issue today because it's important. It's important because sage grouse occupy a lot of areas. It turns out in Utah they're not as important as other species simply because we have less habitat. In places like Idaho or Wyoming, we would be by far more steeped in the sage grouse conversation, but we still care. And it's been an interesting process to see play out, to where the Obama administration put a management plan into place, the Trump administration put a different management plan in place, and now there's been a federal lawsuit where a judge out of Idaho has taken jurisdiction over that, and now we're all kind of waiting around to see what Judge Windmill is going to do with those cases. There's been an injunction put on place with the new plans, which means we're under the old plans, which have been repealed, and it gets confusing that way. And we got to figure this out because sage grouse are an important species. We monitor them every year. You monitor them by and large by counting males on what they call leks, which are their breeding grounds. And not again to put in a shameless plug, but if you're able to go see sage grouse lekking, it's pretty awesome. It's the stuff of wildlife documentaries. It is a truly unique thing with a truly unique sound, and go see it. It's pretty cool. We will continue to monitor the sage grouse situation in the state. Luckily, we don't have the same conflicts or the same degree of conflicts in our areas as other states do, but it's still an issue of concern. ESA issues. We as the state have jurisdiction over, by and large, game species and migratory, less migratory, but game species. Let's go there first. And then we have, in addition to that, if an animal is listed, we generally have some jurisdiction with the federal government through a partnership to manage that. And there's really a lot of cool stories. So on the side over here, that beautiful animal is called the Kanab amber snail, which recently the Federal Register, in fact, 2 weeks ago, published a delist petition based on new genetics that found that the Kanab amber snail is not genetically distinct than other amber snails in the area. There's still some science to be done on that, but that's what the petition reads, and we'll see how that plays out. Going from around the circle then, that beautiful fish up there, can anyone identify it? Yes, sir. That is the June sucker, right? A beautiful fish. Everyone has them mounted on their walls. No, they don't. They live in Utah Lake. As Utah Lake has become an increasingly impaired body of water, June suckers have suffered. There's been an extensive program to repair A, that habitat, and B, to remove some of the other competitors, Asiatic carp being one of them. And it's been pretty successful. In fact, so successful that we are now sitting on an uplist petition. It has been listed as endangered. We're hoping to get it uplisted to threatened, but that's progress and it's going in the right direction. And we have counts on those beautiful animals every single year. And so if you want to go down and catch that beautiful animal in a net, or sometimes with electro shocking methods, it's worth your time. Coming around, Utah prairie dog. I point this out because Utah prairie dog is, well, I used to live in Iron County and I like these guys. You don't probably want to live around because they carry the plague, but you know. They're a cool animal. It's a really, really, really interesting management story on the Utah prairie dog, to where it was listed as endangered, downlisted to threatened in '84. There's a Rule 4D that if you're a farmer in Iron County or in Panguitch County, Garfield County, or in the city of Panguitch, you're able to go out and shoot them off your farms. But if you're a homeowner, you can't do that. It's very weird. And so there's a lot of confusion about why we manage the way we do. Recently, within the last 4 years, there was a court ruling that said indeed this should not be considered a federally listed species because it's only native to Utah. And so for a time, it was off the endangered species list, and the state managed it. Then there was an appeals court ruling that said it shouldn't, that it still should be listed, so it's back on the list. If you look at the numbers of prairie dogs, and then weird as can be, it's only counted on federal lands. It's not counted on private lands. So even if you're inundated on your private lands with prairie dogs, those don't count towards recovery, which is weird. We're working with the federal government to see if we can't get a different status. We have pretty good confidence that based on the fact when the state managed this species, that the numbers did not plummet. In fact, you saw they remain stable or grow. And so we think that we could do a good job managing it as well, and we'll likely be seeking to downlist that as well. And then I'm going to go to the Mojave Desert Tortoise, which is a perennial favorite if you live in southern Utah, and or mostly in the areas right around the Arizona Strip. It's something that we're not looking to downlist because its geographic range is much, much larger than what we got in terms of what we don't have control over it. We do manage habitat for it, and there's some interesting debates ongoing in St. George regarding how we best set aside area for those species. And I'm happy to give you more answers on that in Q&A if you want. Last but not least, and this is a cool story, that beautiful fish is called the bluehead sucker. And if the lights are a little dim, you'd see that it actually does have a blue head. Lives in many streams, but it's most commonly found right here on the Weber River. And we're managing very hard to make sure that the bluehead sucker remains in the Weber River. So not only would we manage when they get listed, if there's a danger of listing, we have programs to put into place to make sure they don't, which is kind of cool. So, aquatic invasives. Are we good? Have I bored you yet? Okay, moving right along to aquatic invasives. This is probably your most important water quality issue right now facing the states. Quagga mussels were found in Lake Powell about 10 years ago. Quagga mussels are about thumb-sized mussels. They are not native to the area, and they are nasty little guys. If you leave anything in the water that's a pipe, that's quagga that's gone around that. And they will do that in a relatively short period of time. They will change the biology of your lakes because of the amount, they're bivalves, and so they'll bring in a bunch of stuff and clear the water from other nutrients for other things that depend on that. And then problematically, they will get into every water system you've got. So that could be your pipe at home, which you'll be surprised to know most people don't want that. Weird. But most people don't want to have mussels, and even when you clear them, you can clear your pipes chemically, but it leaves some biological residue, which discolors your water, and it's safe to drink, but it doesn't taste very good. So this is a big deal. We're trying very hard to contain that. And so what you see around the state, every time you get near a body of water, there will be a boat check-in station. I know it's inconvenient and people hate it. We're asking for more money this year to expand those operations because it is a $1 billion prospect if this were to get outside of that Lake Powell area. I say that because we have a unique plumbing system in Utah. If it gets up to Deer Creek, for instance, then there is or Strawberry, there are a cascading series of reservoirs that then are infected by this. There currently is no financially feasible way to clear them out once they're in that body of water, and so it gets to be very costly. So we're taking that very seriously and trying to get ahead of it. And then I'm going to fly through these because no one wants to talk about Cougars and Bears. We've seen a lot of them. Read the news or watch the news. You see lots more Cougars and Bears this year. There have been big efforts to try to more effectively manage those populations. I know that's controversial and probably more controversial with this population than with others, but it's an ongoing conversation we're having. Similarly, wolves, we don't have an established breeding pair of wolves in the state yet, but it's still a weird management story. Wolves are delisted anywhere east of I-84 and north of I-80. They are still listed anywhere outside of that range, and so if a wolf were to establish a mating pair, say in the Uintas, then that would be treated as a listed species. There's been efforts by the state for a long time to get that species delisted, and we'll see how that plays out. The reason I put up this is not to advertise for Hertz, although it stands out. There's actually a screenshot from CNN that recently there was a story where there was a pack of 6 wolves discovered in western Colorado. It's very likely if wolves are in western Colorado, it's a hop, skip, and a jump away to be in Utah, and then it'll be an interesting conversation we have statewide. So if you want to talk more about that, ask me questions. Parks and Recreation. We're almost done, guys. We're almost done. Parks are cool. It's my favorite part of my job because when I say I work at DNR, no one has any idea what I do. I say, yeah, we work with state parks. And they say, oh, yeah, I love state parks, which is not the response I often get when I say, oil and gas and mining. They just don't say that. So state parks is fun. This says 43. There's actually 44 state parks. One of the unique challenges we have is the state legislature about 10 years ago said, you know what, you should be self-funding. So we have worked very hard since that time to be self-funding by bringing in about $50 million in revenue per year. 82% of that is through the fees you pay when you enter a state park. And then there's only 10% of that comes out of the general fund. So tax dollars. There are some federal dollars in there as well. The reason I point that out is because this is always a debate we have when we go to Capitol Hill about whether or not we should have any general funds at all. I argue that there's some real substantial benefits to having some state funds invested in this. We have some park units that will never make a profit. That's just the way it is. I mean, if you were to talk about this is the place, historical monument, we have a lot of visitation there, but we just don't have there's no revenue stream to upkeep all the properties that we have there. Others, we have dinosaur museums and some other awesome things. And if you're ever in San Juan County, go to the Edge of the Cedars Museum. It is really cool. It's my favorite museum in the state. It's all ancestral Puebloan artifacts and some really cool stuff. So go see that, but that's another thing that will probably never make money. There's some problems there. So one of the things we deal with. So recreation, we allow a variety of different recreational outlets. A lot of different things you can do on state parks. Some is motorized, some is non-motorized, but yurts and other things. And I can say that it's cool because there's never enough of these amenities. One of the things that we're trying to do then is to expand those amenities. The state legislature has asked us to start looking to name state monuments. These would be amenities where people can go visit, but there's probably not a lot of development around it. There's not a campground for instance. So 2 were named this year, Danger Cave and the beehive-looking thing, that's the old Iron Mission down in Iron County again. And it's an interesting project to see how it all plays out, so we'll be watching that. And then we're working with our federal partners. If you've been out of the state in the last maybe 3 or 4 years, you'll see oftentimes if you're in an airport, the Mighty 5 campaign, Explore Mighty, been extraordinarily effective in getting people to travel to the state of Utah to go to our 5 national parks. In fact, so successful that if you look at visitation, especially Arches and and Zion that they're now facing congestion problems to make it a less fun experience for everyone. We are working with our federal partners to say, hey, we have a lot of state parks in close proximity. For instance, if you can't camp in Arches, you might be able to camp in Dead Horse. Or other areas and we'll get into that, or some other places in close proximity. The Gooseneck State Park, which is down on overlooking the San Juan River. What I'm saying, there's lots of opportunities that you might be able to engage in. We're working with them to say, can we have a unified booking system? So if you go to rec.gov, can that also talk to state parks? And that's a cool thing. And then I had a phone call this week from another federal agency that said, we'd be interested in participating as well. There's going to be some lively discussion on how we best sync all these things, because honestly, I think most people coming to see, I could take you personally, and I'm going to put on my previous BLM hat, I could take you personally to some BLM lands that are national park quality in southern Utah that you as a tourist would never know the difference. Similarly, we have state parks that in any other state would be national parks, but for the fact that they're in Utah and then they're in a state park, and people I think they want the recreational amenities, they want the recreational attributes, and I think that we can provide those throughout the state and really stave off some of that congestion. Next, oil, gas, and mining. So I've been working a lot with oil and gas and mining in my 7 months there. They do a lot of different things. So abandoned mine and reclamation, coal, other minerals, so hard rock minerals and others, and then oil and gas. Why I've been working on this so much? Well, we had a little audit from the state legislature that came out, and you can read a scathing legislative audit from Mr. Maffley, and what the finding was that we haven't taken our oversight responsibilities as aggressively as we probably should have. And they found some instances where there was 105 instances where we hadn't been as providing as much oversight as probably should have been given. Now, the audit makes it sound like the sky is falling. The reality is we've done an okay job, and no one's died, and there's been really no environmental catastrophes, but it's something we take very seriously. We take it very seriously, and we need to get right. And it's an important part of the state. I know that there's going to be a diversity of opinions on whether that should continue in the state. I can tell you that it's worth a lot in jobs. It's probably a $3.2 billion industry for the state of Utah. Just in tax revenue alone, it's $76 million just in the bids off oil and gas on excise taxes. And so it's a big deal for the state, but we can talk about that more if you want. Geological Survey, good science at the foundation of good policy, and Geological Survey is an easy group to support. They provide the good science. They go out and look at where things are. Specifically, they'll look at energy and minerals, geologic hazards, so that's earthquakes and others, geologic mapping, groundwater and wetlands, paleontology, and analytical data. As many kindergartners did, I was sure that I was going to be a paleontologist. And it's very cool now to be able to go in and talk from my kindergarten knowledge of paleontology with a state paleontologist who actually knows something, and about the many things that we've got going on. We're exploring right now a new state park that has significant paleontological resources. There's a block that has a lot of Utah raptors that are contained in it that will be moving around. It's just cool stuff, and it's fun to work with these folks. One of the recent things they did is there was a rockfall in Zion. Utah Geological Survey was asked to come down to investigate how that happened, how it can predict future ones, and they produced a report on that, which is, I can't say it's a page turner, but I think it is interesting, and there's some really cool work done. And always doing great work on, say, this is, so for instance, on survey notes, an in-depth look at Ogden Valley's groundwater. This is the type of science that's going to inform the decisions the state engineer does, and to figure out how we best all live together in a resource-limited world. So, one concern that the Utah Geological Survey has is funding, and I'll tell you why that is. They're funded almost exclusively by drilling off of federal lands. If you look at the graph, drilling on or pumping oil and gas on state and tribal lands has increased, and private lands as well. In federal lands, it's decreased, and so that means they've had a deficit, and they're looking at about a $400,000 deficit this year. So after I get done here, I'll go talk to the legislature to make sure that we can emphasize why this is important. Good science is the foundation of good policy. Without that good science, I think that we're operating in the dark, and it's really problematic. So it's something that I take very seriously, and I think we have pretty good indications that we'll be successful, but it's something to watch. Anyways, so I'm going to skip this last portion because I'm out of time and I want to take your questions, but I want to say one of the last things I do, being a recent Fed, is kind of be an intermediary between the state and the federal government. And I put up this map only to show you. The red on this side is where public land holdings are, federal land holdings. This map on the side is where people live, and you'll notice that where there's a lot of public lands, there's fewer people that live there, and vice versa. And so that means that you've got other states that have no idea what we deal with. This is honestly the state seal of Indiana. As was mentioned, I got a PhD at Indiana University. And yes, the state seal of Indiana is a dude chopping down one of the last trees in the picture and scaring off the last bit of wildlife. You can see why they might have a different view of, what public lands and the value of public lands. And it's something that I think that they teach us on how lucky we are. We teach them on sometimes how difficult those decisions can be. And I just put up the side-by-side comparison. The green, and I was showing this to my kids last night because I think it's interesting. The green is the federal land holdings in Indiana. The rest is white. By contrast, Utah, the white is private land holdings. And so we have a super abundance of public lands. And I mean, that's why I live here, honestly. I could probably be doing better for myself in DC. I choose to live here because of the quality of life that it represents and for the fact that I'm able to have my kids experience some of the great things that I was able to experience. So with that, let me ask, do you have any questions for me? Thanks. Yeah.
I wondered if you had any comment about President Donald Trump being concerned with.
I'm going to take a hard pass on that. I don't know. I can say this. I'm not going to defend that. What's that? The question was, do I have any comments on President Donald Trump saying about the need to flush more water down toilets, right? Something like that. And I'm just going to take the hard pass on that as my response. I will say this. One thing that's hard to figure out, and interestingly, and I'm just going to say it for anecdotally, it's really interesting because when we're dealing with the Great Salt Lake right now, so much of the Great Salt Lake may be return flow. It's kind of scary when you start talking about more efficient uses of water. And I'm not saying that, and those are non sequiturs, let me be very clear. I'm not saying that in defense. I'm just saying it's been a really interesting scientific problem. The city of Bountiful, for instance, is very concerned if you stop watering lawns, what that does to their groundwater source. Because so much of their groundwater comes from percolating through lawns. It's going to be something we have to figure out. As to the other question, I got no idea. Thanks. Yes, sir.
Thank you for a very instructive presentation. I had a question. You mentioned the excise taxes on the extractive industries.
Right.
And I'm wondering, how are these funds being used to prepare communities for sustainable economies in the post-fossil fuel era? I know that there's the Community Impact Fund Board.
Sure.
I don't know if you work with them or.
I don't, but I'm aware of it.
Comparable to make sure that folks shift to ultimately to a sustainable economic track?
It's an excellent question, and I think that it's a fair question as well. Repeat the question. Great. The question was essentially how are excise taxes on extractive industries being used, and whether or not they're being used to help those communities that have depended on those extractive industries to transfer to something that's not extractive in nature. Fair? Yeah, or sustainable, right. And I think that it's a fair question. We don't have programs right now where we're looking at that. And I can tell you that I think it's a good question. When you look at coal country right now, coal, for a variety of reasons, is in decline. We have two very sizable coal producers in the state. And if you talk to the town of Richfield, that's a very, very big deal to them, right? If Suffolk Coal goes out of business, that is devastating locally, because not only is it the actual mining, which is a pretty good source of local jobs, but it's also everything associated with that. So it's Barney trucking, a bunch of stuff hauling that coal to market. And you look at what's happened, so a lot of that coal initially went to IPP, which is it's the big power plant right by Delta, if you're familiar with it. That is owned by interests in California who are no longer interested in coal-fired generation, and they're transitioning to natural gas. And what do you do with that coal, right? And so it becomes a really important question. I don't think we have that figured out yet. I got to be honest with you, it's something I think that we all should be concerned about. I would say also we have to be very realistic when we're talking about that transition and what that looks like, because I was just looking up. I mean, a sizable portion of my cell phone, for instance, the board is all petroleum products, right? And I got to figure out we're not in a place where you can just turn off that spigot yet, right? And similarly, when you're talking about base load on energy production, we got to figure out what that base load is. And right now, we don't have the battery capacity to do it. So I think it's going to take some time. So I don't think it's imminent that you're all of a sudden going to be in a post-extractive world, but I think it's something worth considering. Sure. Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here. Appreciate that. Considering that the large number of Utahns are not hunters, why is it that DWR has little to no representation on their board, on the wildlife board, from non-hunters?
I think it's an excellent question. Two things that I'm just going to answer, and I'm not trying to dodge the question. One, we have jurisdictional issues. And most people aren't aware of this, but we don't have authority to manage most species that are not game species. Under state law, that just doesn't exist, right? And so there's that, right? And so and then we haven't been funded to have a sizable non-game species budget, right? So it means, and so what the game board does by and large, is they manage those dollars, right, that are indeed targeted for fishing game and for hunting. So I think that there's some interest in having those people represented. In terms of the makeup of that board, I think it's a fair question. Are you interested?
Sure.
Okay, good. Come talk to me. Okay. I can't make any promises because ultimately there's a process there at the governor's appointment, but let's talk.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned, you dropped the two words global warming at the front end of your presentation, but other than the alluding to issues with, fire suppression and that kind of stuff, what I think a lot of people here would be very interested in, what's your position on global warming and what kinds of things might you add to what we've already been doing?
So I think that it's a great question. I'll be 100% honest in saying I'm not an expert in that field. I'm not. I've read the papers. I think it's hard to argue with those papers, right? As to scale and time frame, I think that we're not great on our predictability yet. That being said, I think there's something to be concerned about. And on water in particular, or in wildfire, it's something I think that we all have to be concerned about. In terms of how we prepare for that, I don't know. And now I'm going to get pessimistic. Someone told me that they hate these presentations because they always have exciting information, but they're always depressing. And I thought, I'm going to try to avoid being depressing, but here I go being depressing, okay? I don't think we as humans, I don't know how we deal with the immediate costs if we were to say, go ahead and say, no more fossil fuels. We don't do that at all, right? And how you sustain that cost. Which means, because what happens is then you'll have politicians that come and say, you know what, that guy has diminished your quality of life. Unless there's a substitute, right? That guy or gal has diminished your quality of life, and so therefore, we're just not good at making sacrifices today for benefits we see in 50 years. And that's the social scientist in me, and we can quibble about that, but I'm saying you see that a lot, whether that be from the federal budget standpoint or from a lot of other areas. So, given that, it worries me that people feel the exigency to do something now. I don't think that they feel that exigency, so they won't. And even in best case scenario, depending on the model you read, if they do, there's a lag of 50 years between when you actually start doing something to when you see the benefits of that something. And that's a problem. So personally, I think that we're going to have technological fixes. Because I think you need some technological fixes in order to maintain some quality of life. And if you don't believe me, look around. We're all many of us are wearing something of polyester or something on your shoes that has petroleum byproducts in it. I just think that we are by far more dependent on that than we give ourselves credit for. People think, well, I'll just start driving electric. That's a great first start, but it's not enough. It's just not enough. So, I mean, I'm opining now. So going back to your question about what we should do, I think we need to take seriously how we be as resilient as possible in the community in a changing environment. And from the water standpoint, that's kind of scary. Because right now, what you're looking at, what the predictions are, you'll have less snow, more rain. Right now, we have big reservoirs up in the mountains called snow, right? And if that comes in a different form, you may not have enough water. So maybe we want to start talking about building more reservoirs, which is a uniquely unpopular conversation. But if the models are accurate, that may be something we want to consider. You're saying no to that?
Yeah. National Geographic claims that we're wasting more water along the Wasatch Front than anywhere in the entire world. So it's resolved.
No, and I'm saying that absolutely conservation is part of it. What I am saying, though, is if you have the same population increase and those models play out in the next 50 years, that's a problem. And so that's my thoughts anyway. We can talk more later. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that great overview. It's amazing to see all what's going on. Back to the DWR, if I can take a minute to ask a specific question about
Sure.
a piece of legislation going through right now. Avid hunter, lifelong hunter, conservationist, HB 125
Okay.
is the bill that would direct the director of the DWR to take immediate action on cougar removal in the event of emergency.
Yep.
My question is, he already has statutory authority to make an emergency permit increase based on the biological data. And essentially, my concern is that this bill thwarts the RAC and wildlife democratic process prior to receiving the big game counts in April,
Yeah.
and then the predator set in August. So how do you, as the director of the DWR, see this,
So I talked to the director of DWR this morning about that specifically. He's been working with the sponsor of the bill. I don't think that we have the answer yet, but it's something to look at, right? And like I mentioned before, if you want to see an exercised community, come down to one of our game board meetings when they're talking about increasing cougar bear permits. You'll find a lot of angry people in the room, and a lot of people that end up leaving unhappy, right? It's not for the faint of heart, but I think it's an important conversation. The bill sponsor in this particular case firmly believes that some of the numbers that he's seeing or lack thereof is specifically due to populations of predators, which is why they're trying to encourage that. So, please.
just by way of a follow-up, if a cougar is going to be harvested, I prefer to see it by a hunter and not by wildlife service and government trappers. And so to the extent that that can be maintained. And then lastly, I hated to see you gloss over the slide on public versus federal versus state management of public lands, because of these public lands we all get to enjoy. So if you have any last comment on your vision for federal versus state management, that'd be awesome too. Thank you.
I think that we spend a lot of money fighting. I would by far prefer to spend that money actually doing something in the shared service or the shared stewardship model. That's my personal preference. Ultimately, I'm not going to be the judge on that because the legislature is going to have some say as well. All that being said, it's been my experience that when approached the right way, there are times when we can work together to do great things. And I think shared stewardship, you're seeing the beginning of that. And I think if you had Vicki Christensen of the Forest Service here, or the Chief Christensen, she would say the same thing. That's a better spot to be in than when we're all in a courtroom and the only people getting rich are the attorneys. I know this is law school, which is good. So.
May I ask a question about the shared stewardship quickly?
Sure.
You brought some interesting ideas sort of to the table here. For example, talking about Gooseneck State Park, and can we reallocate visitors from overcrowded areas like maybe Arches National Park or Moab to these other state facilities? And I know part of that shared stewardship plan is also something like the proposal with the state and BLM jointly to develop a trail system down near Gooseneck. And I'm wondering, does shared stewardship also include any provisions for not just more development to disperse impact, but maybe ways to educate or sculpt public behavior to have a smarter kind of impact rather than just dispersing?
So Yes, but it's not very well developed yet. We're at the front end, right? And right now we were identifying projects that we can get money on the ground this year. $2 million from Utah, $4 million from the feds, which in the bigger scheme of things, and I know that I sound very Washington when I say that, but that's not a lot of money to do these types of projects. So I think that will be a component of it. But I would love to talk to you more. Do you think they should be doing that, and what do you think that looks like?
I do. Well, I think, when I think about Big Five, and it was wildly successful to a fault, where now you have people going places that they maybe are ill-prepared to handle, and we could talk more.
That'd be great.
Okay.
I look forward to it.
Thanks.
Hey, Bob's getting up. I just wanted to say thanks again for letting me be here today. It's been an enjoyable conversation. I'll be here for a little bit. I've got a hard stop around 20 till, because I got to get back to another meeting. But come talk to me if you have questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Ron, for joining us, and thank you all for being here today. Next Thursday, Chris Linder on the global warming book that he's done. So please join us.
I hope it's okay. Okay, I'll get you. Go old school here.